A woman named Ruth Castellano found me through a genealogy website's messaging system on a Tuesday evening, and the first line of her message read, "I believe you may be the daughter I was told died at birth in 1979. I have spent 45 years believing that was true. I was adopted as an infant in 1979 through a private adoption agency in Memphis, Tennessee, by two people I have always known, without any shadow of doubt or complication, as my genuine, loving parents. I grew up understanding my adoption the way many adoptees of that era understood theirs. A closed, confidential process, my birth mother's identity legally sealed, a story I had made a kind of peace with by my 30s, having never felt any particularly urgent need to search further into origins I understood. Simply, as a closed chapter I hadn't personally lived through in any way that felt incomplete. Ruth's message shattered that understanding entirely. She had not, as I had always believed based on what my adoptive parents themselves had been told at the time, voluntarily relinquished me for adoption after a difficult, unplanned pregnancy. She had been told, in a Memphis hospital room in 1979, that her baby, me, had died shortly after birth. A devastating, false story that would remain her entire understanding of what happened to her child for the next 45 years, until a genetic genealogy website's algorithm connected her own DNA sample, submitted years earlier out of what she described as simple, unresolved, grief-driven curiosity, to my own. It took me 11 months, a specialized adoption fraud attorney, a forensic document examiner, and a genuinely difficult reckoning with the two people who raised me to understand that I was one of at least 19 confirmed victims of a black market adoption scheme operated through that same Memphis agency throughout the late 1970s. A scheme in which a corrupt agency administrator had systematically told young, vulnerable mothers their bobbies had died, while secretly selling those same infants to paying adoptive families for fees considerably higher than the agency's official, legitimate adoption costs. If you're new here, welcome to Family Hidden Fight, where we tell you the truth about the wars fought behind closed doors, inside families, including in today's story, a war that began before I could even remember, in a hospital room I have no memory of, built on a lie told to a mother I never knew existed. Today's story is called The Adoption Papers That Were Never Signed. Let's begin. My name is Michelle Henderson. I'm 45 years old. I work as a physical therapist in Nashville, and I was adopted, as an infant, in the spring of 1979, by Richard and Diane Henderson, a couple who had struggled with their own infertility for nearly 8 years before finally, through a private adoption agency called New Horizons Family Services in Memphis, welcoming me into their family roughly 6 weeks after my birth. I want to be clear, from the very beginning of this story, about something that remains true throughout everything that follows. Richard and Diane Henderson are, in every meaningful sense of the word, my genuine parents. They raised me with complete, unwavering love throughout my entire life, and nothing about the devastating discovery this story describes has ever, in any way, diminished the fundamental reality of our relationship. This story is not about the failure of my adoptive family. It is about a crime committed against a young mother, decades ago, by an institution my own parents trusted completely, in good faith, having no more reason to suspect its underlying corruption than the birth mothers whose bobbies it systematically stole. My parents had always shared with me, throughout my childhood and into my adulthood, the general, honest account of my adoption that they themselves had been given at the time. That my birth mother was a young, unmarried woman facing genuine financial hardship, unable to raise a child at that specific point in her life, who had made the difficult, voluntary decision to relinquish me for adoption through New Horizons Family Services, a licensed, seemingly reputable agency that had, by 1979, been operating in Memphis for over 2 decades. I grew up with a generally settled, uncomplicated relationship to my own adoption story, genuinely curious, at various points throughout my life, about my birth mother's identity and circumstances, but never experiencing that curiosity as any kind of urgent, unresolved need requiring active investigation. Given the closed nature of the adoption records my parents had always explained, were sealed by Tennessee law at the time. I had submitted my own DNA sample to a consumer genealogy platform roughly 2 years before this story's central discovery, largely out of the same casual, mild curiosity that motivates many adoptees to eventually explore their genetic heritage. A decision that had, at the time, produced only relatively distant genetic matches and some interesting, if not personally urgent, information about my broader ethnic ancestry composition. Ruth Castellano's message arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening, roughly 2 years after I'd submitted that original sample, a message that I want to describe reading for the first time, sitting at my own kitchen table, with a specific, disorienting shock I still find difficult to fully articulate even now, years later. I believe you may be the daughter I was told died at birth in 1979, Ruth's message began, before continuing with a detailed, specific account of her own experience. Giving birth at a Memphis hospital in March 1979, at 19 years old, unmarried, and by her own account, genuinely eager to raise the child she was carrying, only to be told, hours after delivery, that the baby had died of unexpected complications. A devastating loss she had carried and grieved for the following 45 years, never once suspecting any alternative explanation, until a genealogy website's algorithm, processing a DNA sample she had submitted years earlier largely out of her own eventual, grief-driven curiosity about what her lost child's genetic heritage might have included, identified me as an extremely close genetic match, consistent with a parent-child biological relationship. I want to describe the specific, overwhelming range of emotions this message produced: genuine shock, immediate skepticism given how extraordinary, and on its face, almost unbelievable Ruth's account initially sounded. And underneath both of those reactions, a specific, unsettled recognition that the birth date and general circumstances Ruth described aligned, with unsettling precision, with the general account of my own adoption my parents had always shared with me. I want to describe the careful, methodical process I undertook over the following several weeks to move from Ruth's initial, extraordinary claim toward genuine, independently verified understanding of whether her account could actually be true. I submitted, first, an additional, more detailed genetic analysis through a specialized genetic genealogy service, specifically designed to provide more rigorous confirmation of exactly the kind of close biological relationship Ruth's initial match had suggested. An analysis that confirmed, within roughly 2 weeks, that Ruth Castellano was, with a statistical certainty exceeding 99.9%, my genuine biological mother. This genetic confirmation, while establishing the underlying biological relationship beyond any meaningful doubt, still left entirely unresolved the far more disturbing, central question Ruth's message had raised. How had a woman who had genuinely, sincerely believed her baby died at birth in 1979 come to have a living daughter who had been adopted, that same year, through a licensed Memphis adoption agency, by parents who had themselves been told, in complete good faith, that they were adopting a child whose birth mother had voluntarily relinquished her for adoption? I want to describe the specific, difficult process of reaching out to Ruth directly. Once the genetic confirmation was complete, a conversation I approached with considerable caution and uncertainty, genuinely unsure, going into it, how to begin processing what appeared, increasingly, to be a genuinely extraordinary, disturbing situation, extending well beyond ordinary questions of closed adoption records or birth family curiosity. I met Ruth in person, roughly 6 weeks after her initial message, at a restaurant in Memphis, a meeting I want to describe as one of the more genuinely disorienting experiences of my entire life. Meeting, for the first time at 45 years old, a woman who was biologically, unmistakably my mother, carrying, throughout that entire meeting, a specific, raw combination of genuine joy at finally, impossibly, meeting me alive, alongside a profound 45-year grief, now fundamentally recontextualized by the devastating understanding that her loss had never actually been what she'd been told it was. Ruth described, over the course of our several-hour first meeting, her own detailed account of what had happened in March 1979, a difficult labor and delivery at a Memphis hospital, followed, several hours after birth, by a doctor and hospital social worker informing her together that her baby had experienced unexpected, severe complications and had died shortly after delivery, a devastating loss she had grieved in the following decades, without ever once being offered any opportunity to see or hold her child, a detail that, at the time, she'd understood as a standard, if painful, hospital protocol for exactly this kind of tragic outcome. But that, understood now in light of everything we would eventually uncover, took on a considerably more sinister significance. "I never had any reason to doubt what they told me," Ruth said, at one point during that first meeting, her voice carrying a specific, raw grief I found genuinely difficult to witness. "I was 19 years old, alone, terrified, and the people telling me my baby had died were doctors and hospital staff, people I had absolutely no reason, at that specific, devastating moment, to suspect of lying to me about something this fundamental and this cruel." I want to describe the specific, methodical investigation Ruth and I undertook together over the following several months, working to understand exactly how and why this deception had occurred. An investigation that began with identifying, and eventually, tracking down the specific hospital social worker who had delivered the false news of my death to Ruth in 1979. That social worker, a woman named Patricia Kowalski, had, we discovered through a combination of hospital employment records and eventually direct outreach, retired from social work roughly 2 decades earlier and now lived in a small town outside Nashville. Ruth and I, working together, made the difficult decision to reach out to her directly, hoping she might be able to provide some direct, first-hand account of what had actually happened and why. Patricia's response, once we finally reached her and explained the genuinely extraordinary situation, revealed a detail that fundamentally reframed our entire understanding of what had happened. Patricia herself had genuinely, sincerely believed at the time that Ruth's baby had died. She had not, by her own detailed account, knowingly participated in any deliberate deception, but had instead been herself deceived by a specific physician, a doctor named Harold Weissman, who had informed her, as the hospital's social worker responsible for coordinating with the adoption agency in cases of infant death, that Ruth's baby had died shortly after birth, information she had, in complete good faith, then relayed to Ruth herself. "I want you to understand something important," Patricia told us, during an emotional, difficult phone conversation. "If what you're telling me actually happened, if that baby didn't actually die, the way Dr. Weissman told me she had, then I was lied to just as completely as Ruth was. I have spent decades believing I delivered accurate, if devastating, news to a young mother in the worst moment of her life. If that news was actually a lie, I need you to know that I never would have knowingly participated in something like that, and I am genuinely, deeply horrified to learn I might have been an unknowing part of it." I want to describe what our subsequent investigation, now expanding to include a specialized adoption fraud attorney I'd retained, a woman named Cynthia Ross, who had genuine, specific prior experience with exactly this category of historical black market adoption case, revealed about Dr. Harold Weissman, the physician Patricia had identified as the original source of the false report regarding my death. Dr. Weissman, we discovered, had served, throughout much of the 1970s, as a physician with a formal ongoing consulting relationship with New Horizons Family Services, the same Memphis adoption agency through which my own adoptive parents had, in good faith, adopted me in 1979. A relationship, Cynthia's investigation revealed, that involved Dr. Weissman regularly attending deliveries, specifically involving young, unmarried mothers the agency had identified prior to delivery as likely candidates for adoption placement, a practice that, on its own, wasn't necessarily improper, given the legitimate historical practice of many adoption agencies maintaining formal relationships with specific hospitals and physicians during this general era. What made Dr. Weissman's specific conduct fraudulent, rather than simply reflecting this broader, legitimate historical practice, was a pattern Cynthia's continued investigation, working alongside a specialized team of researchers, and eventually, Additional confirmed victims who came forward once our own case became more widely known within the broader adoption search and reunion community, established across multiple, independently confirmed cases. Dr. Weissman had, in a specific subset of cases involving young mothers who had expressed genuine, active reluctance about proceeding with adoption during their pregnancy, mothers, like Ruth, who had genuinely wanted to keep and raise their children, deliberately, falsely informed these specific mothers that their bobbies had died shortly after birth, while simultaneously coordinating with New Horizons Family Services to place these same, genuinely healthy infants with paying adoptive families. Families who were themselves, in every case Cynthia's investigation was ultimately able to confirm, told the standard, legitimate story of a voluntary relinquishment, entirely unaware of the actual, deceptive circumstances underlying the specific child they were adopting. I want to describe how our own investigation, once it began attracting attention within the specialized adoption search and reunion community, ultimately connected with a considerably broader, previously fragmented pattern of similar cases, eventually confirmed, through Cynthia's continued investigation, and a growing network of affected birth mothers and their now-adult children, to involve at least 19 separate, confirmed instances of this exact same fraudulent pattern, spanning roughly a 5-year period throughout the mid to late 1970s, all connected to New Horizons Family Services and Dr. Weissman's specific, ongoing consulting relationship with the agency. Cynthia's investigation, working alongside a genetic genealogist, and eventually, an investigative journalist who became interested in the broader story, once its scope became clear, ultimately established that Dr. Weissman had received, according to financial records the investigation was able to obtain through formal legal discovery, a specific additional payment from New Horizons Family Services for each infant successfully placed through exactly this fraudulent mechanism. Payments considerably higher than his standard consulting fee for legitimate, properly consented adoptions, providing a clear, documented financial motive underlying his specific, deliberate choice to target young mothers who had expressed genuine reluctance about proceeding with a voluntary adoption. I want you to understand the specific, calculated cruelty of what this scheme actually targeted, Cynthia explained, during one of our case review meetings, once this broader pattern had become clear. Dr. Weissman wasn't simply facilitating adoptions from mothers who had already, genuinely decided to relinquish their children. He was specifically identifying mothers who hadn't yet made that decision, who were still actively hopping to keep and raise their bobbies, and deliberately, falsely telling them their children had died, removing, entirely and permanently, from these specific mothers, any possibility of changing course, reconsidering, or ever pursuing their genuine, expressed wish to raise their own children, precisely because a dead baby cannot be reclaimed or fought for in any way a living adopted child theoretically still could be. I want to describe the specific, genuinely difficult process of telling my own adoptive parents, Richard and Diane, about this discovery, a conversation I approached with considerable care, understanding, going into it, how profoundly this news might affect their own understanding of an adoption story they had, themselves, believed in complete good faith for the past 45 years. My parents' reaction, once eyed carefully, gently walked them through the full account of what Ruth and I had discovered, unfolded through a specific, painful sequence I recognized as genuinely similar in its broad shape. To the reactions described in several of this channel's other stories involving family members processing a fundamentally destabilizing discovery about their own trusted history, initial disbelief, followed by a specific, profound grief connected not to any diminishment of their own relationship with me, but to the devastating understanding that the adoption they had always believed reflected a genuinely voluntary, if difficult, decision by my birth mother had, instead, been built on a deliberate lie told to a young woman who had never actually wanted to give me up at all. "I need you to know something clearly, Michelle," my father told me during that difficult conversation, echoing, in its own specific way, the same fundamental reassurance my own experience researching similar family discoveries has taught me is genuinely common and important across exactly this category of story. Nothing about this changes who you are to us, or who we've been to you for your entire life. We adopted you in complete, genuine good faith, believing entirely that we were providing a loving home for a child whose birth mother had made a genuinely difficult, voluntary decision. Learning that this wasn't actually true doesn't change the reality of the family we've built together. But I understand, completely, why you need to pursue whatever accountability and whatever relationship with Ruth feels right to you, and I want you to know we support that completely, without any reservation. I want to describe something my mother, Diane, said, later that same evening, that I've held on to since as one of the most important, clarifying moments of this entire ordeal. I think about Ruth and what she's carried for 45 years, and I feel a specific kind of grief I don't think I've ever quite experienced before, Diane told me. We built our entire family, our entire life together, on something that caused her unimaginable, unnecessary suffering, without either of us ever knowing it. I don't know how to fully hold that alongside my own genuine, complete gratitude for the family we built. I don't think those two things cancel each other out. I think they just both have to exist together, however uncomfortable that combination actually is. I want to walk through the specific, genuinely complex legal landscape Cynthia navigated in pursuing formal accountability for this decades-old scheme, because the legal questions involved proved considerably more complicated than several of the more straightforward financial fraud cases featured elsewhere on this channel. I want to be honest with you about the specific legal challenges here, Cynthia explained during our early case planning. We're dealing with conduct that occurred over 4 decades ago, well beyond the ordinary statute of limitations for most categories of fraud, involving a physician, Dr. Weissman, who died roughly 15 years ago, meaning direct criminal prosecution against the actual perpetrator is no longer possible. What remains available to us involves several distinct, separate legal avenues. Pursuing civil claims against New Horizons Family Services itself, which, while Dr. Weissman is deceased, continued operating for years after this specific scheme, under different leadership, before eventually closing entirely roughly a decade ago. Pursuing formal legal action to unseal and correct the fraudulent adoption records themselves, given clear evidence that Ruth's consent to relinquishment was never actually genuinely obtained. And separately, pursuing broader legislative and advocacy efforts to ensure other affected families, both from this specific scheme and from similar historical black market adoption, practices that unfortunately occurred with some regularity throughout this general era nationally, have clearer legal pathways toward accountability and record correction than currently exist in many states. The specific challenge of New Horizons Family Services' own legal status, having ceased operations roughly a decade earlier, meant that any civil recovery would need to proceed against whatever remaining corporate assets or successor liability might exist. A genuinely complicated corporate law question that required Cynthia to work alongside a separate corporate litigation specialist to fully investigate what legal recourse, if any, actually remained available against the underlying institution decades after its original, fraudulent conduct occurred. I want to describe the specific, meaningful legal victory Cynthia and Ruth's broader legal team ultimately achieved regarding the adoption records themselves, which proved, in many ways, more immediately significant to Ruth's own healing process than any financial recovery ultimately could. Cynthia successfully petitioned Tennessee's Vital Records Office, supported by the genetic confirmation of Ruth's and my biological relationship, alongside the broader documentary evidence Cynthia's investigation had assembled regarding Dr. Weissman's fraudulent pattern, to formally amend the state's official records regarding my birth and adoption, correcting the record to reflect that Ruth's consent to relinquishment had never been genuinely, validly obtained. Given the fraudulent circumstances under which she had been deceived into believing no living child existed for her to potentially reclaim or reconsider placing for adoption. I want to describe what this specific legal correction meant to Ruth once it was finally, formally achieved, roughly 9 months into our broader legal process. I know this doesn't undo 45 years of believing you were dead, Ruth told me, once we'd received formal confirmation of the record's correction. But it means something enormous to me that the official, permanent record now reflects the actual truth, that I never voluntarily gave you up, that what happened to us was a crime, not a choice I made. I've carried a specific kind of guilt, for decades, believing I somehow failed to protect you, even though I understood, intellectually, that a baby's death from medical complications wasn't something I could have prevented. Understanding now that you never actually died, that the choice I believed I never got to make because you were already gone was actually stolen from me entirely, changes something fundamental about how I've understood my own role in what happened, even though it also, in its own way, opens an entirely new, different kind of grief about everything we both lost because of what Dr. Weissman and this agency chose to do. I want to describe how connecting with the broader network of confirmed victims from this same scheme, over the following several months, became one of the more genuinely significant, if complicated, threads of this entire ordeal. Cynthia's continued investigation, combined with growing public awareness once our own case attracted attention within the specialized adoption search and reunion community, and eventually, some regional media coverage, ultimately connected us with several other confirmed birth mother and adoptee pairs affected by this same New Horizons Family Services and Dr. Weissman's scheme, each navigating their own version of the same, genuinely disorienting reckoning our own family had experienced. I want to describe meeting one of these other adoptees, a woman named Karen Whitfield, 43 years old, whose own reunion with her birth mother had occurred roughly 2 months before our own group began coordinating more formally. A meeting that produced, I want to be honest, a specific, complicated sense of both genuine solidarity and, separately, a renewed, sharpened grief about the sheer, deliberate scale of what Dr. Weissman and the agency had actually orchestrated. It's strange and genuinely devastating, understanding that what happened to my own mother wasn't some isolated, unusual tragedy, Karen told me during our first meeting. It was a deliberate, repeated business practice, targeting specific mothers who wanted to keep their bobbies over and over again, for years, purely for the additional financial profit it generated for the agency and for Dr. Weissman personally. I don't know if that makes it easier or harder to process, honestly, understanding the scale of it. Some days it feels like solidarity, knowing I'm not alone in this specific kind of grief. Other days it feels like an entirely new, separate horror, understanding just how calculated and how repeated this specific cruelty actually was. The civil litigation against New Horizons Family Services' remaining corporate successor entity, pursued jointly on behalf of the 19 confirmed victim families by a coordinated legal team including Cynthia and several other attorneys representing the broader group, ultimately resulted in a negotiated settlement roughly 14 months after our own case began. A settlement that, given the agency's genuinely limited remaining corporate assets after over a decade of ceased operations, produced considerably more modest individual financial recovery than the underlying harm might, in a more financially robust defendant's case, have warranted. I want to be honest with you about the specific limitations of what financial recovery can actually accomplish here, Cynthia told our broader coordinated group during a joint meeting discussing the eventual settlement terms. The agency's remaining assets, even fully distributed across all 19 confirmed victim families, produce a genuinely modest individual recovery, nowhere close to reflecting the actual, profound harm each of you and your families have experienced. I want you to understand that this settlement reflects the genuine, practical limits of what remains legally and financially recoverable, decades after the underlying conduct occurred and given the specific, limited assets still available, rather than any true, adequate accounting of what this scheme actually cost each of you. I want to describe how our broader group, once this reality became clear, redirected much of our own collective energy away from pursuing the maximum possible individual financial recovery, and toward, instead, a broader collective advocacy effort, working, alongside Cynthia and several other legal advocates specializing in exactly this category of historical adoption fraud, to support broader legislative reform efforts, particularly regarding statute of limitations provisions and record correction processes, specifically intended to provide clearer, more accessible legal pathways for other affected families from this and similar historical schemes nationally who might not yet have discovered their own affected status. I want to describe something I found genuinely meaningful and, in its own way, unexpectedly hopeful. The relationship that gradually developed between Ruth and my own adoptive parents, Richard and Diane, over the roughly 2 years since Ruth's initial message. I had genuinely, initially worried, going into this entire process, that introducing Ruth into our family's ongoing life might create some kind of fundamental, difficult tension between her and my adoptive parents. A worry that, I want to be honest, reflected my own limited imagination about how these 3 specific people, each having experienced this same underlying tragedy from such profoundly different vantage points, might actually navigate building some version of an ongoing relationship together. What actually developed, instead, over the following 2 years, was a genuine, if inherently complicated and unusual, friendship between Ruth and my parents, built on their shared, mutual recognition that all 3 of them had been, in their own separate ways, victims of exactly the same underlying fraud. My parents deceived into believing they were providing a home for a genuinely, voluntarily relinquished child. Ruth deceived into believing that same child had died, with none of them ever having any reason, at the time, to suspect the actual truth connecting their separate, parallel experiences. I don't think I ever expected to genuinely like the woman who raised my daughter, Ruth told me, during a recent conversation, roughly describing a dinner she'd shared with my parents just the previous week. But Richard and Diane gave you a genuinely wonderful life, Michelle, exactly the kind of life I always hoped, even in my grief, that you might have had if things had gone differently. I think I've come to understand that my own healing doesn't actually require resenting them for something neither of them had any more knowledge of or control over than I did. We were all deceived by the same people, in our own separate, devastating ways. I want to introduce someone whose involvement became genuinely significant to the broader accountability our group ultimately achieved. An investigative journalist named Marcus Delaney, who worked for a regional Memphis newspaper and became interested in our broader story once several of us, working together as a coordinated group, decided to go public with our experience roughly 8 months into the legal process. I want to be honest about why this story matters so much to me personally, Marcus told me during our first interview together. I've covered a lot of historical injustice cases over my career, and there's a specific pattern I've come to recognize in stories like yours. Institutional failures that caused genuine, devastating harm to people who had absolutely no power to protect themselves at the time, buried and forgotten for decades because the people responsible either died before facing any accountability, or because the institutions involved simply dissolved and disappeared, taking whatever documentation existed with them. I think there's real, important value in bringing stories like this into public awareness, both for the specific families directly affected and for the broader public understanding of exactly how vulnerable historical adoption practices could genuinely be to exactly this kind of exploitation. Marcus's eventual multi-part investigative series, published roughly 10 months into our broader legal process, brought considerably more public attention to our case than any of us had initially anticipated, ultimately connecting us with several additional confirmed victim families we hadn't previously identified, and separately, prompting several state legislators to begin exploring potential reform legislation, specifically addressing historical adoption fraud cases and the particular legal barriers, like statute of limitations restrictions, that make pursuing accountability for decades-old conduct so genuinely difficult. I don't think any of us fully understood, going into this, how much broader an impact our own individual family's story might eventually have, I told Marcus, during a follow-up interview roughly a year after his original series was published. We were just trying to understand our own truth. It's been genuinely meaningful, watching that specific, personal search turn into something that might actually help other families we'll never even meet. I want to return to Cynthia Ross, our attorney, because a broader conversation I had with her, near the conclusion of our own case's primary legal proceedings, offered genuinely important context about how common this specific category of historical fraud actually proved to be, extending well beyond just our own specific Memphis case. I want you to understand the broader historical scope of what we're dealing with here, Cynthia told me during one of our final case debriefing conversations. The specific practices your family's case involved, private agencies, operating with genuinely minimal government oversight, sometimes engaging in deliberate, profit-driven fraud against vulnerable young mothers, occurred, unfortunately, with some regularity across the country throughout the mid-20th century, extending, in various documented cases I've personally worked on, from the 1940s through at least the late 1980s in various states. Before considerably more rigorous adoption regulation and oversight gradually developed. Some of these historical schemes, like the well-documented Georgia Tan case in Memphis decades earlier than your own family's situation, involved considerably larger, more systematically documented patterns of fraud. Others, like the specific Dr. Weissman scheme your family was affected by, remained smaller and more localized, discovered only relatively recently as consumer DNA testing has made this kind of historical reunion and discovery considerably more accessible than it was even 15 or 20 years ago. I asked Cynthia whether she believed there remained a genuinely significant number of similarly affected families who simply hadn't yet discovered their own situation. I believe that, unfortunately, quite strongly, she said. Every time a case like yours receives some public attention, we typically see additional affected families come forward. People who had their own version of an unexplained, unresolved grief or an adoption story that never quite made complete sense, who hadn't yet had the specific catalyst, a DNA test, a chance connection, a piece of investigative journalism, that might finally help them understand what actually happened. I think there's real, ongoing value in stories like yours being shared publicly, precisely because you never know which specific detail might be the one that finally helps another affected family recognize their own situation. I want to describe how I navigated explaining this entire, genuinely complex situation to my own two children, ages 17 and 14 at the time these events unfolded, because I think the specific challenge of explaining a decades-old historical fraud, discovered through their own mother's unexpected reunion, deserves its own attention. My older daughter, Sophie, 17 at the time, engaged with this discovery with a specific, thoughtful curiosity that surprised me somewhat, asking detailed, careful questions about the broader historical context of adoption fraud and the specific legal mechanisms Cynthia was pursuing on our family's behalf. Questions that, I came to understand, reflected her own developing interest in social justice and legal advocacy. An interest this specific family experience seemed to have meaningfully deepened and personalized for her. I think it's genuinely important that you're sharing this story publicly, Mom, Sophie told me, at one point during our ongoing family conversations about the situation. Not just for our own family, but because I think about how many other people might be out there, still not knowing what actually happened to them, and I think stories like ours might be exactly what helps them finally understand their own situation. My younger daughter, Emma, 14 at the time, processed the discovery somewhat differently, focusing considerably more on the immediate, personal question of what having a new biological grandmother meant for her own life and relationships, a more concrete, personally oriented processing that I came to understand as an entirely appropriate, age-typical way of engaging with what was, for her, primarily a significant addition to her own immediate family relationships, rather than a broader historical or social justice question. Does this mean I have another grandma now? Emma asked during one of our early family conversations, a question that, in its own simple, direct way, helped me understand how differently my two daughters, at their respective ages and stages of development, were each processing the same underlying family discovery, and how important it was for me to meet each of them where they actually were in their own understanding, rather than expecting a single uniform family conversation to adequately address both of their genuinely different needs and questions. I want to close with a specific, deeply meaningful moment. The day, roughly a year and a half after her original message, that Ruth visited my parents' home for the first time, the actual house where I had grown up, where my adoptive parents had raised me throughout my entire childhood. A home Ruth had, for 45 years, never known existed, connected to a daughter she'd believed had died before ever seeing the inside of any home at all. I want to describe watching Ruth walk through that house, my parents guiding her carefully, gently, through rooms filled with decades of family photographs documenting a childhood and life she had never known was actually happening. My first day of school, family vacations, my own wedding, photographs of my own children as infants, an entire rich visual history of exactly the kind of ordinary, loved life she had spent 45 years believing had never actually had the chance to unfold at all. Ruth stopped, for a long moment, in front of a photograph from my 6th birthday party, my father helping me blow out candles on a cake, my mother laughing beside us, an entirely ordinary, joyful family moment captured decades before any of us knew Ruth existed. I used to imagine, sometimes in my worst moments of grief, what your life might have looked like if you'd lived, Ruth told me, standing in front of that photograph, tears streaming down her face in a way I understood immediately, reflected some complicated combination of grief and genuine, overwhelming joy. I never actually let myself imagine anything this specific, this real. It felt too painful, imagining a whole entire life I'd never get to actually witness. And now here it is, all around me, this whole real life you actually got to live, and I get to finally see it, even 45 years late. My mother, standing beside Ruth in that moment, gently took her hand. "You get to be part of whatever comes next now," my mother told her. "That's not everything you lost, but it's something real starting today, and we're genuinely glad to have you here." I think about that specific moment often, watching two women who had each, in their own profoundly different ways, loved and lost and grieved the same child, standing together in the actual physical space where that child's real, ordinary, loved life had genuinely unfolded. A moment that captured, more completely than any legal settlement or records correction ever could, exactly what this entire difficult journey had actually been for. For every family built on a story that might not be the full truth. If you're watching this and you are an adoptee, a birth parent, or an adoptive parent carrying some version of an adoption story from an era when closed, sealed adoption records and considerably less regulated agency practices were genuinely common, I want to say something directly to you. The story you were told, however sincerely and completely believed by everyone who shared it with you at the time, is not always the complete, accurate truth, particularly for adoptions that occurred during the several decades when private adoption agencies operated with considerably less oversight and regulatory scrutiny than exists today. This doesn't mean every closed adoption from this era involved fraud. The overwhelming majority, based on everything Cynthia's broader work in this field has taught me, reflected genuinely voluntary, if difficult, decisions by birth parents navigating real hardship. But the specific pattern my own family experienced was not, unfortunately, entirely unique, and consumer DNA testing has, in recent years, begun surfacing considerably more of these historical cases than anyone previously fully understood existed. If you're an adoptee with any lingering, unresolved curiosity about your own origins, consider pursuing genetic testing, and, if you're comfortable doing so, connecting with the broader adoption search and reunion community that has developed considerable expertise in exactly this kind of historical investigation. If you're a birth parent who was told, decades ago, that your child had died, and that loss has never fully made sense to you, know that consumer DNA testing has, in recent years, reunited numerous families who believed, for decades, that reunion was permanently, tragically impossible. I was told my entire life, a story about my own adoption that I believed, completely and without complication, for 45 years. That story turned out to be a devastating lie, told not by the parents who raised me, who believed it just as completely as I did, but by people who profited, deliberately and repeatedly, from a young mother's unimaginable, unnecessary grief. I'm grateful every day that a genealogy website's algorithm and one woman's unresolved, grief-driven curiosity finally brought that truth into the light, however many decades too late it arrived. My name is Michelle Henderson, and this has been another family hidden fight. If this story reminded you of an adoption story in your own family that might deserve a closer, more careful look, consider this your gentle encouragement to pursue that truth. Tell us your own story in the comments. It might become a future episode. Subscribe for a new family hidden fight story every week, and we'll see you in the next one.